Good day, everybody. I'm Val Kohler from Reed Educational Trust. We are a national NGO, and our primary function is teacher development and literacy support in the classroom. So we go into the classrooms and we observe teaching and learning behaviors and to see if lesson outcomes were achieved. We then support both the teacher and the learner. So while we've been in the classroom, we had observed certain behaviors from certain learners. And we found that many of the learners have become disenchanted with learning. They just did not enjoy school. And the reasons were that they were reading below grade level and their writing needed a lot of support. But because classrooms were so big many times, these children did not receive individual attention regularly or daily, which meant that many of them were unable to focus on the teacher or focus on the lesson because the teacher was teaching at grade level and they were not there. They would then become disruptive or they just didn't focus. They were just not really interested. They found school exceptionally boring. With the result, many of them stayed out of school. So there was a high absentee rate. Parents didn't know how to support their children and they then kept their children at home without a valid reason. As Reed, we then looked at how do we support these learners to continue their journey with learning? How do we support them in getting the skills that they need to be successful learners, successful readers, and successful writers? We then read up and looked at research. What did research tell us? We found that effective after-school programs brought a wide range of benefits to the children, to their families, and to their communities. It also found that children that attended after-school programs would boost their academic performance in classroom. It also reduced antisocial behavior and it provided a safe and structured environment for the children who were interested in improving their academic performance. We also found that children attending 21st century community learning programs improved their reading, and those who attended these centers regularly made a significant difference in their academic gains. We found that effective after-school programs improved classroom behavior because children were now able to participate in the classroom. They were learning skills in the afternoon, and when they brought it into the classroom, it made a difference in their learning environment. Those were also the learners who possibly would not drop out of school. So when looking at the learning centers, what we were hoping to achieve was to give learners the opportunity to work independently, to get the attention that they sought, that they did not often find in the classroom, and that they could share their experiences with a friend or a peer. But overarching was we wanted children to experience the joy of having access to books. And it would be books of their interest, books that they wanted to look at, that they could sit alone, they could look at pictures and they could read. And so our primary source was making books available to the learners in the classroom. We then established what would our aim be, and the aim was to work with the learners, with the parents, with the adults in the community to develop both the adults and the learners' language skills, to build confidence in themselves to want to learn and giving them the confidence to know that they could learn, and also to promote a culture and a love for reading. And that would be our primary focus. So now then, how do we entice the learners to our learning centers, knowing what we wanted to do and how we were going to do it? We found that in order to entice them, we were going to use a story-based program. So everything will center around a story because everybody loves stories. We all love listening to stories. And so we found themes that were exciting and that it was interesting. And the materials that we would make available would be materials that would be interactive. The children will handle and manipulate their learning materials. They were not going to be passive recipients of knowledge, but they were going to engage with the knowledge actively. We used educational games, and all of the games encouraged logical thinking, reasoning, intelligent thinking. We wanted our children to be critical thinkers. We used social games like treasure hunts. Children loved treasure hunts. They loved looking for clues. They loved listening to clues. They often imagined that they were on TV when they were doing treasure hunts. We encouraged collaborative storytelling. We would give them concrete apparatus, perhaps toys of dinosaurs, and they would have to make up their own story. They loved dramatizations, and so whatever we did was we fostered listening, speaking, and creative collaborative learning. So now we knew what we wanted to do, and we knew how we were going to do it and with whom we were going to do it. We needed to find a venue. And so we partnered with the City of Cape Town. They gave us 4 community centers in which we could start our programs, which we were very grateful for. And so we went on a walkabout in the community. We handed out flyers, we spoke to parents, we spoke to any adults, explaining to them what our program was going to be about, and that the motto of our program was going to be fun in learning. We connected with the schools in the area, we explained to them, and they were very excited. The schools were really our ambassadors. They promoted our program to the learners at their schools, and indirectly to the community. So this is the community center in Lavender Hill, and here's where we started one of our learning centers. So now we had the learners, we had the venue, we had the support, and now we looked at what is the program? What would the outcome of our program be? What is it that we wanted to achieve with our learners? And one of the things was, the first thing was social learning. Our children were very angry, aggressive at times. They live in high density living. They didn't have their own space. And so we knew that when you put things down, they would always fight about it. There would always be an argument. And so we taught them to appreciate there was enough for everybody, that we were here to support, that we will hold their hand. And so we taught them social learning. And in doing so, we built up the learner's self-esteem. And so we're not talking about the self-esteem, we're talking about the learner's self-esteem. Many of our children don't have a problem being with their self-esteem. They're quite talkative and chatty, and they'll do what they like. But when you ask them to read or to speak or to do something academic, they would literally take 2 steps back. They were reluctant to do it. And so we built up their learner's self-esteem. We encouraged them to believe that they could do all things on their level, and with time, they will improve. And with the self-esteem, almost automatically came a positive attitude towards school. We wanted to improve the children's vocabulary, enrich their vocabulary, and with their vocabulary enrichment came a love for books. So this were the outcomes that we were hoping to achieve. We wanted our children to be interested in reading and therefore improve their writing. But more, it was reading with understanding, so they could speak with understanding and write with understanding. And all of this needed to be underpinned by getting our learners to be critical thinkers, to think about what they were doing, why they were doing it, and how it was going to impact their learning. We chose themes like Into the Wild, which was about wild animals. And what was very interesting in the communities that we work in a community where we are hybrid speakers. We fuse English and Afrikaans. So our children may have a vocabulary in English and a little bit in Afrikaans. For example, they will say a shark in English and a shark in Afrikaans. Few of them knew that in Afrikaans a shark was actually called a haai. And so we built up the general vocabulary. So we spoke about Into the Wild, animals under the sea. They loved dinosaurs, heroes, loved fantasy because of all the movies that they watched. And we spoke about careers. And so these themes was the vocabulary that they needed for everyday interaction in their classroom. We also then decided on a format initially that would work for the learners. We understood that learners needed boundaries, and many of them loved routines because the routines gave them security. They knew what was going to happen and they knew what was expected of them. So they would come into the community center before we started, and they would gravitate towards the bookshelves that we had. We always had displays of books, and the children could do independent reading, choose the book of their choice, find a space to read, and then we would go into Simon Says. So that was a listening skill. All of our activities started with a listening skill, listening and speaking. We found that our children had a problem listening. They did not know how to listen. The assumption was that everybody can listen, but few really can. We don't know how to listen, and we believe that listening must be actively taught. children must listen to words. They must understand what is required of them, and they must know how to execute that which has been required of them. So we initially started with a game called Simon Says. That would be our first listening skill, and we would go off into another. But the children loved playing Simon Says, and so that became our standard opening activity. We would play Simon Says. I discovered that the children loved playing Simon Says because they challenged themselves. The listening improved, and so the more they played, the more they had learned to listen. And when they were caught out, or it was they just didn't listen effectively, they would get angry with themselves, mad, and insist that we play it again because they wanted to master the game. And in mastering the game, they were mastering listening. Then we would have a reading aloud activity, and the trainer or one of the supporting adults from the community would read the children a story. And so we would have storytelling. We'd read them a story. We'd ask questions before, during, and after. We'd ask the learners to make connections to the story, text to themselves, text to text, and text to the world. That often led to discussions which would be very interesting. After story reading, children will have a group activity, and the group activity would be linked to the story. So if it was a story of fantasy, they would play a fantasy board game, they'll play fantasy cards, they may make a fantasy character, they could write stories about it. So that was usually a group or a peer activity. And then we would have an independent activity, and children could then decide what it is that they wanted to do. And often in our independent activity, many of the children gravitated towards puzzles. They loved building puzzles. We discovered many of our learners had not ever done a puzzle in their lives, never in their homes, and seldom in their classrooms. And this was really sad. And they just simply loved puzzles because they understood, they thought about it, they were making connections, they were making links. And we'd end off our session once again with independent reading. Again, the children could go to the bookshelves or the book displays that we had. We'd have two book displays. One would be on the theme, and the others would just be general books with all different genres, and children could decide what it is they wanted to read. Then I want to show you some photographs of, and so this is our book display, and here we have a little boy, and he's just decided that this is the book that he was going to read. We would have a display of the theme, and this was a fantasy theme, so we'd put up posters, we'd have pictures of fantasy, vocabulary, books, and so children could just walk around and they could interact with the displays that we had. They could have a walkabout. This was a theme box, and in these boxes would be all the manipulatives, all the games, and this would just be an activity box for the learners, and each child, when we could, would get their own box. Individual games, peer games, thinking and reasoning. There's a board game on fantasy, and here the girls are playing cards. Card games could take on various forms. It will be memory cards. It will be there'll be words, adjectives. Our games just took on different forms. We had lots of fun games. Here we have a puzzle, and this is a geography puzzle, and so children indirectly were learning content as well as skills. Here we have a peer activity. Children are sorting through cards, they play in OXO, and we would have community people or the trainer going around supporting the learners. We encouraged all children to come to the learning centers. We would work with them on different levels. Our first session would be the IP and then the FP. And here we have children who's not ever had the opportunity to play with Lego or with puzzles. And these photos show just how interested children are in learning. Everybody wants to learn. The staff that worked at the community, they were the gems. We trained them how to support us, they guided us, and they would go around and give the learners the individual help that they needed. Here we have a staff at the community reading a story to the learners and going around helping them. And so the journey of learning continues at the learning centres in the Western Cape. We are grateful to the City of Cape Town as well as the staff who supported us. And so I want to thank you for the opportunity that you've given us to share with you